A Factor of Evolution. By P. Kropotkin. Introduction. Two aspects of animal life impressed me most during the journeys which I made in my youth in eastern Siberia and northern Manchuria. One of them was the extreme severity of the struggle for existence which most species of animals have to carry on against an inclement nature, the enormous destruction of life which periodically results from natural agencies, and the consequent paucity of life over the vast territory which fell under my observation. And the other was, that even in those few spots where animal life teemed in abundance, I failed to find, although I was eagerly looking for it, that bitter struggle for the means of existence, among animals belonging to the same species, which was considered by most Darwinists, though not always by Darwin himself, as the dominant characteristic of struggle for life, and the main factor of evolution. The terrible snowstorms which sweep over the northern portion of Eurasia in the later part of the winter, and the glazed frost that often follows them, the frosts and the snowstorms which return every year in the second half of May, when the trees are already in full blossom and insect life swarms everywhere, the early frosts and, occasionally, the heavy snowfalls in July and August, which suddenly destroy myriads of insects, as well as the second broods of the birds in the prairies, the torrential rains, due to the monsoons, which fall in more temperate regions in August and September, resulting in inundations on a scale which is only known in America and in Eastern Asia, and swamping, on the plateaus, areas as wide as European states, and finally, the heavy snowfalls, early in October, which eventually render a territory as large as France and Germany, absolutely impracticable for ruminants, and destroy them by the thousand. These were the conditions under which I saw animal life struggling in northern Asia. They made me realize at an early date the overwhelming importance and nature of what Darwin described as the natural checks to overmultiplication, in comparison to the struggle between individuals of the same species for the means of subsistence, which may go on here and there, to some limited extent, but never attains the importance of the former. Paucity of life, underpopulation, not overpopulation, being the distinctive feature of that immense part of the globe which we name Northern Asia, I conceived since then serious doubts, which subsequent study has only confirmed, as to the reality of that fearful competition for food and life within each species, which was an article of faith with most Darwinists, and, consequently, as to the dominant part which this sort of competition was supposed to play in the evolution of new species. On the other hand, wherever I saw animal life in abundance, as, for instance, on the lakes where scores of species and millions of individuals came together to rear their progeny, in the colonies of rodents, in the migrations of birds which took place at that time on a truly American scale along the Ussuri, and especially the migration of fallow deer which I witnessed on the Amur, and during which scores of thousands of these intelligent animals came together from an immense territory, flying before the coming deep snow, in order to cross the Amur where it is narrowest. In all these scenes of animal life which passed before my eyes, I saw mutual aid and mutual support carried on to an extent which made me suspect in it a feature of the greatest importance for the maintenance of life, the preservation of each species, and its further evolution. And finally, I saw among the semi-wild cattle and horses in Transbaikalia, among the wild ruminants everywhere, the squirrels, and so on, that when animals had to struggle against scarcity of food, in consequence of one of the above-mentioned causes, the whole of that portion of the species which is affected by the calamity, comes out of the ordeal so much impoverished in vigor and health, that no progressive evolution of the species can be based upon such periods of keen competition. Consequently, when my attention was drawn, later on, to the relations between Darwinism and sociology, I could agree with none of the works and pamphlets that had been written upon this important subject. They all endeavored to prove that man, owing to his higher intelligence and knowledge, may mitigate the harshness of the struggle for life between men, but they all recognized at the same time that the struggle for the means of existence, of every animal against all its congeners, and of every man against all other men, was a law of nature. This view, however, I could not accept, because I was persuaded that to admit a pitiless inner war for life within each species, and to see in the war a condition of progress, was to admit something which not only had not yet been proved, but also lacked confirmation from direct observation, On the contrary, a lecture on the law of mutual aid, which was delivered at a Russian Congress of Naturalists, in January 1880, by the well-known zoologist, Professor Kessler, the then dean of the St. Petersburg University, struck me as throwing a new light on the whole subject. Kessler's idea was, that besides the law of mutual struggle there is in nature the law of mutual aid, which, for the success of the struggle for life, and especially for the progressive evolution of the species, is far more important than the law of mutual contest. This suggestion, which was, in reality, nothing but a further development of the ideas expressed by Darwin himself in The Descent of Man, seemed to me so correct and of so great an importance, that since I became acquainted with it, in 1883, I began to collect materials for further developing the idea, which Kessler had only cursorily sketched in his lecture, but had not lived to develop. He died in 1881. In one point only I could not entirely endorse Kessler's views. Kessler alluded to parental feeling and care for progeny, see below, Chapter I, as to the source of mutual inclinations in animals. However, to determine how far these two feelings have really been at work in the evolution of sociable instincts, and how far other instincts have been at work in the same direction, seems to me a quite distinct and a very wide question, which we hardly can discuss yet. It will be only after we have well established the facts of mutual aid in different classes of animals, and their importance for evolution, that we shall be able to study what belongs in the evolution of sociable feelings to parental feelings, and what to sociability proper, the latter having evidently its origin at the earliest stages of the evolution of the animal world, perhaps even at the colony stages. I consequently directed my chief attention to establishing first of all, the importance of the mutual aid factor of evolution, leaving to ulterior research the task of discovering the origin of the mutual aid instinct in nature. The importance of the mutual aid factor, if its generality could only be demonstrated, did not escape the naturalist's genius so manifest in Gouda. When Eckermann told once to Gouda, it was in 1827, that two little wren fledglings, which had run away from him, were found by him next day in the nest of robin redbreasts, Rothkuchen, which fed the little ones, together with their own youngsters. Gouda grew quite excited about this fact. He saw in it a confirmation of his pantheistic views, and said, if it be true that this feeding of a stranger goes through all nature as something having the character of a general law, then many an enigma would be solved. He returned to this matter on the next day, and most earnestly entreated Eckermann, who was, as is known, a zoologist, to make a special study of the subject, adding that he would surely come to quite invaluable treasuries of results. Gespratia, edition of 1848, volume 3, pages 219, 221. Unfortunately, this study was never made, although it is very possible that Brehm, who has accumulated in his works such rich materials relative to mutual aid among animals, might have been inspired by Gouda's remark. Several works of importance were published in the years 1872 to 1886, dealing with the intelligence and the mental life of animals. They are mentioned in a footnote in Chapter 1 of this book, and 3 of them dealt more especially with the subject under consideration, namely, Les Sciences Animales, by Espinasse, Paris, 1877, La lutte pour l'existence et l'association pour la lutte, a lecture by J. L. Launesson, April 1881, and Louis Buchn's book, Leben Liebesleben in der Tierwelt, of which the first edition appeared in 1882 or 1883, and a second, much enlarged, in 1885. But excellent though each of these works is, they leave ample room for a work in which mutual aid would be considered, not only as an argument in favor of a pre-human origin of moral instincts, but also as a law of nature and a factor of evolution. Espinasse devoted his main attention to such animal societies, ants, bees, as are established upon the physiological division of labor, and though his work is full of admirable hints in all possible directions, it was written at a time when the evolution of human societies could not yet be treated with the knowledge we now possess. Launesson's lecture has more the character of a brilliantly laid out general plan of a work, in which mutual support would be dealt with, beginning with rocks in the sea, and then passing in review the world of plants, of animals and men. As to Bush's work, suggestive though it is and rich in facts, I could not agree with its leading idea. The book begins with a hymn to love, and nearly all its illustrations are intended to prove the existence of love and sympathy among animals. However, to reduce animal sociability to love and sympathy means to reduce its generality and its importance, just as human ethics based upon love and personal sympathy only have contributed to narrow the comprehension of the moral feeling as a whole. It is not love to my neighbor, whom I often do not know at all, which induces me to seize a pail of water and to rush towards his house when I see it on fire. It is a far wider, even though more vague feeling or instinct of human solidarity and sociability which moves me. So it is also with animals. It is not love, and not even sympathy, understood in its proper sense, which induces a herd of ruminants or of horses to form a ring in order to resist an attack of wolves, not love which induces wolves to form a pack for hunting, not love which induces kittens or lambs to play, or a dozen of species of young birds to spend their days together in the autumn, and it is neither love nor personal sympathy which induces many thousand fallow deer scattered over a territory as large as France to form into a score of separate herds, all marching towards a given spot, in order to cross their river. It is a feeling infinitely wider than love or personal sympathy, an instinct that has been slowly developed among animals and men in the course of an extremely long evolution, and which has taught animals and men alike the force they can borrow from the practice of mutual aid and support, and the joys they can find in social life. The importance of this distinction will be easily appreciated by the student of animal psychology, and the more so by the student of human ethics. Love, sympathy and self-sacrifice certainly play an immense part in the progressive development of our moral feelings. But it is not love and not even sympathy upon which society is based in mankind. It is the conscience, be it only at the stage of an instinct, of human solidarity. It is the unconscious recognition of the force that is borrowed by each man from the practice of mutual aid, of the close dependency of everyone's happiness upon the happiness of all, and of the sense of justice, or equity, which brings the individual to consider the rights of every other individual as equal to his own. Upon this broad and necessary foundation the still higher moral feelings are developed. But this subject lies outside the scope of the present work, and I shall only indicate here a lecture, Justice and Morality, which I delivered in reply to Huxley's Ethics, and in which the subject has been treated at some length. Consequently I thought that a book, written on mutual aid as a law of nature and a factor of evolution, might fill an important gap. When Huxley issued, in 1888, his Struggle for Life Manifesto, Struggle for Existence and Its Bearing Upon Man, which to my appreciation was a very incorrect representation of the facts of nature, as one sees them in the bush and in the forest, I communicated with the editor of the 19th Century, asking him whether he would give the hospitality of his review to an elaborate reply to the views of one of the most prominent Darwinists, and Mr. James Knowles received the proposal with fullest sympathy. I also spoke of it to W. Bates. Yes, certainly, that is true Darwinism, was his reply. It is horrible what they have made of Darwin. Write these articles, and when they are printed, I will write to you a letter which you may publish. Unfortunately, it took me nearly 7 years to write these articles, and when the last was published, Bates was no longer living. After having discussed the importance of mutual aid in various classes of animals, I was evidently bound to discuss the importance of the same factor in the evolution of man. This was the more necessary as there are a number of evolutionists who may not refuse to admit the importance of mutual aid among animals, but who, like Herbert Spencer, will refuse to admit it for man. For primitive man, they maintain, war of each against all was the law of life.
Gerard K. O'Neill linked his colonies with a revision of the limits to growth thesis. In 1972, a study commissioned by the Club of Rome, The Limits to Growth, concluded, following the concerns of Robert Malthus in the late 18th century, that if the current exponential increases in population, consumption of resources and pollution continued at the same rate, then the limits to growth on Earth will be reached relatively soon, within the next 100 years, at which point there will be a sudden decline in population and industrial capacity. O'Neill's revision was not accepted immediately, but after a successful and now legendary conference at Princeton in 1974 and a seminal article in Physics Today, his ideas began to find popular support. In 1989, he published The High Frontier, which was to replace older books like Lasser's The Conquest of Space as the Bible of space colonization. Although O'Neill himself was not the instigator, the L5 Society was formed by followers of O'Neill, dedicated to making his plan a reality. Often utopian dreamers, these visionaries were inspired by O'Neill to think that their dreams could become a reality. Many of their arguments why this should be done still inform today's pro-space movement. Arguments about the resources and living area available in space, the value of spreading life and civilization, etc., can be traced to this era. These groups, though founded on the plans that would supposedly be profitable, still put much faith in NASA to achieve them. Recently, private colonization plans, such as those of the Artemis Society, have been developed. But it is little appreciated that the colonization of outer space has already started with the International Space Station. Here are living quarters for human beings, and here experiments are being conducted on the effects of gravity loss on human beings and other species. George W. Bush's Space Exploration Initiative includes plans for a permanent lunar base manned in 6-month shifts. Other still less exotic forms of humanization are already well in place. We have already encountered humanization in the form of militarization and, via satellites, the surveillance of society and broadcasting information and propaganda. It now seems clear that this process is to be extended, with outer space being envisaged as a source of energy and materials. Within the scientific literature itself, a number of reasons have been put forward for planetary engineering. Haynes and McKay summarize 11 arguments, which can be reduced to 4 distinct grounds for planetary engineering. 1. Planetary engineering could be the first step in colonization. Terraforming a planet for human settlement can resolve Earth's ecological crisis and its limits to growth. It could also provide escape in the case of nuclear war or asteroid impact. 2. In a postmodern society which lacks any sense of unifying mission or purpose, a grand project would reunite a fragmented and disillusioned world. It will provide inspiration to young people as well as economic and scientific stimulation to other areas of society. 3. Changing the climate of other planets would lead to improved knowledge and appreciation of Earth's ecology. It is argued that by gaining a working knowledge of how to create a planetary ecology, we will be better able to understand our own. 4. The intrinsic worth of life makes spreading life to other planets desirable. Finally, it is argued that planetary engineering should be undertaken merely on the basis that spreading life has value in itself. Haynes and McKay also provide a list of arguments against planetary engineering, many of which point to possible unforeseeable consequences. They are clearly not concerned, however, that the bacteria we transplant to Mars may mutate and return to Earth. The more fundamental issue is how the very idea of planetary engineering reflects on our perceived relationship with the rest of the universe. The rest of the universe, according to these arguments, is something to be mastered, a mere means to human ends. This is a modern reflection of the Baconian position. There are, however, some less anthropocentric positions, including some that want to introduce life to other planets without making them fit for humans at all. But across all positions, there is without a doubt a faith in human ability to control nature, even if this is perceived as being for nature's own sake. Indeed, it is even seen as being humanity's role to do so. As Frederick Turner argues, quote, "The radical ecological thinker would have us ignore the reflexive and dynamic capacities of the human mind and act as if we were merely one species of plant or animal among many in the garden, and not the gardener or shepherd, which is our true role." Unquote. In October 1962, 5 years after the Soviet Union launched Sputnik, the Earth's first artificial satellite, on October 4, 1957, a year and a half after Soviet cosmonaut number 1 Yuri Gagarin completed the first manned space flight on April 12, 1961, to be followed shortly after in August by German Titov, cosmonaut number 2, and 2 months after cosmonauts number 3 and 4, Adrian Nikoliev and Pavel Popovich, completed the first group orbit of the Earth. The Soviet popular journal Science and Religion published a lengthy editorial taking stock of the first cosmic 5-year plan. 5 years of storming the heavens, as the editorial was called, marveled at Soviet accomplishments in an area that had until recently only existed in the realm of fantasy: human space travel. More specifically, the editorial readdressed the question that had been haunting the imagination of both East and West in the course of these 5 space years. How did it come to be that Soviet Union managed to do what Tsarist Russia could not even dream about? namely the accomplishment of such heroic feats in the fight for progress, the competition with more technologically and economically developed countries, unquote. Why was it that it was Soviet cosmonauts who managed to fulfill the long-cherished dream of humankind, when they, quote, ceased to envy the bird and flew, relying not on the power of their muscles, but on the power of their reason, unquote. And finally, what did it mean that the first man who, quote, stormed the heavens was Gagarin, son of a steelworker, from a peasant family, Russian, Soviet, communist, and godless, unquote. In the ideological opposition of two world systems that defined the Cold War, Gagarin's alleged, quote, godlessness, unquote, and the godlessness of cosmonauts in general was not insignificant. Soviet supremacy in space had a direct connection to the system's, quote, scientific, materialist, and therefore atheist worldview. Indeed, that this was the logic of modern history, unquote. Humankind's path to the cosmos was lined with the fierce resistance of religion, unquote. Yet, he chased out the mythical god from the boundaries of the earth, made nature submit to his will, and become a giant, victorious over the elements, directing the laws of nature and society. Finally, when he mastered the earth, humans began their conquest of the heavens, the, quote, holy of the holies, unquote. Material objects, quote, created by the sinful hands of the godless, broke through the celestial spheres, and humankind, whose insignificance the clergy has reiterated for centuries, is accomplishing space flights, creating and controlling artificial planets, and conquering the cosmos. This teleological narrative left little room for interpretation or doubt. It called for believers to abandon their, quote, dark superstitions, unquote, and it urged atheists to combat religion, which remained an obstacle in the path to the enlightened society of the communist future. With the dawn of the space age, atheists were mobilized to intensify atheist education, so that, quote, the sun of reason, unquote, would shine upon those who lagged behind the march of human progress. From the beginning, human space exploration has represented as much as anything else a spiritual quest, a purification of humanity, and a search for absolution and immortality. Spaceflight as spiritual quest found expression from the very first unveiling of the American space program. It has grown in significance over time and fundamentally reflects nostalgia for a simpler time in which issues had greater clarity. Never mind that these issues only appear more understandable because of the passage of time. Take the example of Apollo nostalgia, which manifests itself in several ways. It may be found in numerous popular conceptions of Apollo, especially in film, literature, music, theater, and advertising. It harkens back to an era of the 1960s in which order ruled and all seemed in its place. Central to this, in the pre-Great Society and pre-Social Reformation era, white men oversaw America in a leave it to beaver type of existence, where women were docile helpmates. Ethnic and race relations favored American-born whites, and all understood their place in the system. Most important for reinforcements of this nostalgia, the system worked and in memory enjoyed efficiencies lost in a postmodern, multicultural setting. This longing for a distant, dimly remembered, and ultimately inaccurate past represents perhaps the most troubling aspect of this nostalgia. A recent study completed for NASA concluded that representations of space exploration are highly nostalgic. Boomers have a great nostalgic affection for NASA, the study concluded. But their own priorities have shifted from a future focus to maintaining what they have. They see money spent on space exploration as threatening their future entitlements. At a sublime level, Apollo nostalgia may serve as a trope for a larger lack of interest in the future expressed by Americans at the beginning of the 21st century. As a country, a shifting cultural center of gravity toward maintenance of the status quo, rather than looking to the future, has stalled a shared national vision that energized earlier efforts. At a uniquely oblique angle, human spaceflight in general, and perhaps Apollo in particular, represented the incarnation of a new religious tradition. The connections between conventional religion and spaceflight are very real, and some have drawn those parallels. But the fact that human spaceflight might also be itself a new religion is especially telling. The linkage of these elements was expressed eloquently by Norman Mailer at the time of the Apollo program. Mailer stated that these missions were really about seeking to become one with God. They don't know what to do when they get there. The fact that it's technological is what's wrong with it. It's too exclusively technological. People are sick to death of technology. The technologists themselves are wondering how they can control technology before technology wipes out the Earth. So what we are looking for at this time in human history is an enlargement of human consciousness, a rediscovery of spiritual values to which we can adhere because they deepen us.
Today the U.S. military depicts its forever wars of public safety and security as newly deterritorialized, that is, an everywhere war that can, in principle, occur anywhere and is thus no longer sequestered spatially, either horizontally or vertically, to battle spaces putatively outside U.S. borders. Instead, through new strategies for the reproduction and suspension of state sovereignty, such as drones and satellites operated from within U.S. territories, on the one hand, and an invisible empire of foreign military bases and paramilitary proxies across the globe, on the other, the U.S. security state purports to have conquered the challenges of space-time in armed conflicts and is therefore unbridled from the territorial strictures that have historically defined it. The abstract sense of temporal limitlessness of a planetary forever war is further evidence that the U.S. military has been most preoccupied by a struggle to overcome the geographic limitations of warfare and sovereignty in its pursuit of global supremacy over the past several decades. Along with a lack of sustained public consciousness of U.S. involvement in all-out global warfare, this borderless vision of 21st century military empire links temporally and spatially dispersed bodies and geographies through differential forms of management and extermination, revealing the nation as a forever war machine, seemingly enduring, mutable, and eternal. In the months leading up to the launch of Sputnik 1, the secrecy around the rocket dog program gave way to a carefully calibrated publicity campaign. Geared for a global audience, media coverage of the program celebrated Soviet technological achievements, portrayed the dogs as unique individuals, and linked their journeys in rockets to the advent of human spaceflight. A few weeks after Alexei Pokrovsky, the director of the Institute of Aviation Medicine, reported on the first two flight series at a scientific conference in Paris, an interview with him appeared in the Soviet newspaper Trud. Photographs of dogs called Albina and Malishka, both veterans of the second test series, depicted healthy, alert animals that could have been mistaken for lap dogs, confirming the claim that they were well-treated conquerors of the cosmos. Echoing the popular song Fasia Vish, Ever Higher, which described the destiny of a generation born to make fairy tales come true, Pokrovsky clarified that we do our work in order to bring the time nearer when human flight in space will move from fairy tales to real life. Over the next 2 years, dogs remained central to Soviet efforts to master space, with work proceeding along two fronts. Scientists resumed vertical launches into the upper atmosphere using dogs to gather data about the effects of weightlessness, radiation, G-forces, and extreme temperatures on living organisms. Engineers continued to design larger vehicles for orbital deployment and develop insulation and braking mechanisms that would make the safe return of these crafts possible. In August 1958, Belyanka, Whitey, and Pestryle, Spotty, survived a suborbital flight that carried them nearly 300 miles above the Earth. Like Laika, The dogs underwent extensive training to accustom them to the cramped conditions of the space capsule, the noise of its instruments, and the vibration and pressure they would experience in the initial phases of the flight. Although their flight was widely acclaimed, their fame paled in comparison to that of Otwesnaya, Courageous, who weathered 5 suborbital flights to great heights between June 1959 and July 1960, earning her the moniker world's most traveled space dog. In the London Times, a picture of Otwesnaya and the rabbit, Marfusha, that had been her crewmate ran directly adjacent to a photograph of Malcolm Scott Carpenter, one of the 7 men in training for flight on an American satellite. The Soviets pointed to Otwesnaya's continued good health and Marfusha's litter of healthy kits as evidence that humans could also be protected from the potential environmental dangers of space. "Space is getting closer," proclaimed a Soviet headline after the dog's 3rd flight.
The factory was served by boats which normally returned to the mainland overnight. However, on 2nd of October, a storm whipped up so rapidly that the boats had to remain tied at anchor for the evening. And as Hayes had noticed, all of them had little dinghies, complete with oars tied to their side. If he could get out from the prison after bed check and swim out to the boats, he could relieve one of the owners of their dinghy and row to the mainland. The prospect of the swim didn't faze him. He had been a lifeguard and a surfer in his time. Screwing up his courage, Hayes slipped out after the bed check and crawled across the rocks. knowing that at best if he was caught, he would be returned to Samalcılar. At worst, he could be shot by the guards. As unobtrusively as possible, he entered the water and began swimming quietly towards the moored boats, hoping that the searchlights manned by the guards wouldn't be turned in his direction. He reached a dinghy and was in the process of cutting it loose, using a knife that he had liberated from the canning factory, when he was nearly discovered by the owner of the boat. Narrowly avoiding being seen, Hayes cut through the rope and rowed himself past the rest of the boats and the end of the island. His muscles strengthened from yoga and carrying large sacks of beans around, Hayes was able to row through the night and hit the beach around the time the next morning that the guards realized that he had escaped. His initial plan had been to ask a favor from a prisoner friend and hide in his hotel in Istanbul. However, when he got there, he learned that his friend had just gone to Afghanistan. Hayes' hopes of remaining in a basement till the hue and cry died down faded.